Good afternoon, fellow patriots. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to Patriot Radio, broadcasting live from deep inside the heart of the future Liberty State. Sponsored once again by On Fire Ministries, in the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story and the news behind the news, where it's not about right or left, it's about right and wrong. It's about our hope not being in man, but in Jesus Christ. About not ending in prayer, but moving to action. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Father, deliver us from the evil one.
Welcome to Patriot Radio.
Good afternoon, fellow patriots. This is Matt Shea, and I'm here with Megan today. We're going to be doing our first episode of Gen Z, asking questions of, well, I'm not going to say what generation I'm in, but let's say Isaac generation for right now. We say here at On Fire Ministries.
Yeah, we can say that.
We can.
We can.
It's not Abraham yet. It's not too gray, I don't think.
No.
But we want to bring some authenticity to the discussions that are in the country today, and really talk about the details behind things, where people can go to find primary source information, read about it for themselves, and just do this unscripted. So I don't know the questions that Megan is going to ask. Try and draw upon all the resources that I've got and point everybody in the right direction if I don't know an answer. We're going to be doing this every week so that you in the Jacob generation can actually hear the truth and find it for yourself. So with that, Megan Needham, thanks for joining me on Patriot Radio and I guess holding me to account for the next generation, right?
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to be here, Matt. And I have quite a list of questions for you planned for this lovely episode. But I think, for me, the biggest question that I have been thinking about the most recently is there going to be a World War III? And I know a lot of my generation might be a little tired of people talking about, oh, there's going to be World War III, everyone's bombing everyone. And if there is a World War III, do you think it will come to U.S. soil?
So we are already in a world war, but I'm going to back up, okay? I'm going to back up. So about 5 years ago, based on some just objective intelligence analysis, we saw very clearly some patterns beginning to form. And so here on Patriot Radio 5 years ago, you can go back and look at the episode. I was talking about how there would be a war between Russia and Ukraine first. It would happen right after the Olympics. And then that there would be a war between Israel and Iran. And then there would be a war between China and Taiwan, very likely drawing in the United States of America. How could I possibly have known that 5 years ago, right? What patterns were there, and what was coming to the fore at that time that was giving me the indicators? And I think that's what we want to talk about today a little bit. To answer your question directly, yes, but we're already in a world war. Yeah. And it really comes down to the question of how you define war. Right now, we're in a cyber war worldwide. Even Trump the other day admitted, somebody said, well, China's doing this to us and has hacked our infrastructure. He says, you don't think we do that to them? I mean, kind of a very open moment of candor, where he's like, yeah, no, we do this to everybody else too. We do economic warfare against all these other countries. Right. And so we'll put some of that into perspective. But to give a primary source document, 2 Chinese colonels wrote, it's almost 20 years ago now, I think. It was called Unrestricted Warfare. And these 2 Chinese colonels, I think, are generals now. And they wrote this paper on how they wanted to change warfare in the world, and particularly toward the United States. The Chinese see the United States as an existential enemy, meaning that the United States' existence threatens the existence of China. And that's true, because the existence of liberty and freedom does threaten the existence of communism anywhere it is. So that's actually a true statement. But the revolutionary part of this for the Chinese was building off of a speech. It's called the Secret Speech by General Chi Watian, and some people pronounce it Hoshin, in 2000. And General Hoshin he theorized that if we attack the United States, that the Chinese should use a biological weapon targeted at genetics to do that.
COVID.
Very interesting. This is 2000.
Wow.
and he's a very influential man. And then he further said that the United States needed to be depopulated by about 200 million people.
Wonder how they're doing that. Probably abortions.
Right, and other things, right? And promoting a demoralization campaign.
Right.
We'll get to that here in a little bit, probably. So when he said that, he was deadly serious. This should be the plan going forward. And so people will say, well, why would the Chinese depopulate America? Because they want to occupy American soil. So any warfare they do, they don't want to go wholesale and destroy ports or destroy houses or destroy neighborhoods because they want their people to occupy it.
Right.
So that's what's super important to understand about this. That's the way they are viewing warfare. And so the two Chinese colonels in unrestricted warfare then said, we need to make every area of life a battlefield. Communication, pharmaceuticals, information, politics, everything. And so if you study Maoist insurgency doctrine, Mao Zedong was the leader of the communist revolution in China. Chiang Kai-shek was a leader of the nationalists. And the communists, unfortunately, were aided by elements inside the United States. It was the origin of the deep state under the Roosevelt administration.
Wow.
And so they sold out Chiang Kai-shek, and he moved his forces, the Free Chinese, to Taiwan back then. That's the genesis of what we're facing today. So these Chinese colonels, when they said, we want to make economics warfare, we want to make, trade warfare, finance warfare, we want to make everything warfare, they meant it, and they started down that path. In about 2017, a very famous intellectual in China, Jin Kanrong, wrote an article about attacking the United States using the U.S. election system. And I've seen the briefing with my own eyes. And I believe, just as Kash Patel put out the other day, and we reported on here on Patriot Radio, that the 2020 election was an attack by China on the United States. So they're weaponizing even elections. So going back to Mao Zedong, in the Maoist insurgency model, there were 5 main points of it. The first was called the United Front. And the idea was that every entity that the Chinese put out there would have the same information that would be released across this entire front of organizations. So this explains why you could be on the East Coast and they say the term Easter worshipers, and you're like, what is that? I've never heard that before. And then you go to the West Coast and they say Easter worshipers were, murdered in the Middle East. And everybody's like, what is that? You mean Christians?
Yeah.
That's such a weird thing. Why would they use the same phrase in 2 different places on the news? And I think this is important for the Jacob generation to understand. When you start hearing these phrases over and over and over again, you need to understand this is 5th generation warfare and things are being manipulated. The other thing that I'll highlight of the 5 points in Maoist insurgency doctrine was something called political warfare. They believed that politics was a warfare model. And so the Chinese began what they called the elite capture scheme to corrupt, buy off, compromise through sexual compromise, etc., American leaders, business leaders, politicians, influencers, but not just in the United States. They actually did this all around the world. So when you say, hey, are we at war right now? Or is there going to be a World War III? No, we're already at war, and this is really what it means. I can dive in a little bit deeper if we need to.
So there already is a war. We're already in a war.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's potential, that they could be bombing us? I think that's the next question.
Yeah.
If a violent war comes to the United States soil, will they be bombing us? And another huge question that's going around social media right now, especially with what's happening in Israel and Iran, is there going to be a draft?
Well, so...
And how do we avoid it? How do I get out of it?
Well, then we get into a little bit of worldview. I don't believe that when you have a draft that women should be included in the draft, because I believe men should be put between the forces of evil and the place that brings forth life.
But they
and that
could
is
change the legislation.
They could. But I believe that, that's just my worldview with that. And so it's not a patriarchal worldview. It's just, hey, we want to protect the place that brings forth life, right?
I also did hear that if you're actively pregnant as a woman, you can't be drafted. even as a woman, you can't be drafted.
Yes.
But that's something I heard. So.
Well, for women that are already in the military, yes, they are put on a profile and they're not allowed to go and deploy overseas if they're found to be pregnant.
So if you're not in the military and you're a woman, you're safe.
So have babies.
You're safe and have babies, but you're safe
inside the boundaries of marriage.
Exactly.
All right. So when you're asking about the warfare and draft, all men between the ages of 18 and 45 generally are considered the irregular militia. You can actually read it inside most state constitutions. Washington State Constitution has a similar provision. And the whole reason for that actually historically comes from something called knight's tenure, which was a property right in medieval Europe that came out of the Roman Empire. Here's the short version of it. Roman soldiers would finish their service. They'd be given some acreage and a mule, and they would go to the fringes of empire. That's a massive oversimplification. When the Roman Empire began to disintegrate, those soldiers obviously knew what they were doing and had large estates. They began to bring people in to protect their estates. And so what evolved out of that was called knight's tenure, where I would give you, let's say, 20 acres, but you had to bring forth 100 soldiers at my command if our land was invaded so we could protect against the invasion. So that means you had to train regularly, had to have enough weapons. This is where the Second Amendment actually comes from.
Right.
So when the Founding Fathers came here to America and they were facing Indian attacks and they were facing other threats, they formed these militias again, and they expected every able-bodied man between the ages of 18 and 45 to be armed, trained, and ready to go at a moment's notice. This is why we had Minutemen at the onset of the Revolution. So what that looks like today now is essentially a draft. In the case of an invasion, in the case of a world war, men would be called forward to protect the United States, protect the homeland. But it was for the privilege of living here and having the opportunity to own property in the United States, they would call you forth out of that again from knight's tenure. So I know it's a little bit long, but for people that want authenticity, go back and look at this stuff.
Yeah.
Read it. And then all of a sudden begins to make sense. All right, so back on China, one of the third point of the Maoist insurgency doctrine I'll highlight today is military action. And the way that it happens is they will smuggle people in to a country, and the Asian warfare model is totally different than the Western warfare model. In the Asian warfare model, they bring their supply chain, or the Western warfare model, excuse me, we bring our supply chains behind the army. So you have an army, you have like trucks and airplanes bringing supplies behind it. In the Asian warfare model, they fight to their supplies. So when you see the Chinese buying farmland, for example, manufacturing facilities, for example, in the Asian warfare mindset, they're telling us where they want to invade and go to.
Wow.
Now, back in, and this is after the fall of the wall in Russia, so 1991. We know this from various intelligence sources. The Russian military intelligence apparatus met with the Chinese military apparatus, and they said, hey, we want to figure out how to beat the United States. This is after the wall fell. So this idea that like Russia somehow was like going to be pro-West, that misses some really key things that happened after the wall fell. They came together and they said, listen, we want to figure out how to beat the United States. And here's what they said. Here's what they decided on. We will covertly infiltrate the United States of America, set up caches of weapon inside the United States of America, similar to the model that was used by the German army to invade Norway in World War II. And when we come back from the break, I will finish what that means.
What if I told you you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today.
And we're back from the break. Megan and I are doing our first Gen Z episode aimed at bringing the details, the history, the primary source documents, and the authenticity to the issues of the day. So before the break, Megan, we were talking about World War III.
Yes. I have a question for you about, I know we were just talking about the draft. I would like your opinion on the men of today. How do you think that they would do in active war? Because for me personally, I feel like I can tell that we haven't shipped the men off somewhere to fight in a while, and I feel like maybe it might benefit them just a little bit. But not saying that I advocate for war in any way. But we can tell. We can tell they haven't been sent away on a mission together for a while.
Just a skosh, as it were. So, well, there's been an effeminization of men.
Yes.
And it's been an intentional thing to make men weak. And actually, the reason for it is to degrade them prior to World War III. And there's just been an intentional degrading of the United States military prior to the Trump administration this time to just drag it down. And so it's not ready for World War III, which means there is a plan, and there is a globalist plan for there to be a world war, regardless of what anybody else wants, which generally should be peace. So are the men ready? There is a significant portion of the population that is waking up, and men that are waking up today.
Yeah.
But there is a significant portion of the population that is not ready, that is effeminized, that worships comfort, that plays video games, that has not moved out of their mom's house and they're 30 years old, for example.
At BronyCon.
They might attend BronyCon. And for those of you that don't know what that is, we have it on a separate episode. It's
quite interesting, actually.
It's actually horrendous.
But I would like to ask, do you think it's part of China's demoralization campaign to effeminize the men of the Western world?
Guys dressing up in spandex like a unicorn? I think that probably is, yes.
Because I feel like the explosion of TikTok, how it totally blew up in 2020 when COVID hit, I feel like that's when we saw the surge of they, thems, and zers, and this pronoun campaign that came along. And so I feel like I've also heard that TikTok's algorithm here in America is quite different than the one in China.
Of course it is. TikTok is a Chinese intelligence gathering apparatus. I mean, It is. I mean, everybody knows that.
Yeah.
So the debate should be around, should we allow a foreign country to do that? The second thing is they're using what's called the activity-based intelligence model. In other words, I'm going to get 5,000 data points on you, Megan, your digital self, know you better than you know yourself. And then I'm going to try to introduce things on TikTok for you to watch that are going to alter your behavior in a certain way. And so we see that happening. And China is gloating over Americans mutilating themselves to make themselves combat unready, by the way, or physically unready. I mean, literally physically unready. Because they want to, they want to demoralize and they want to weaken the United States. I mean, this is why you see the Chinese. And I want to explain the historical context behind this briefly, but the Chinese owning pot shops and pot grows. Why is that in America?
They do?
Well, yeah. In fact, right here in our own city,
wow.
You actually see the precursor chemicals for fentanyl being sent to cartels in Mexico, which are then turned into fentanyl and smuggled into the United States of America.
Oh my gosh.
And carfentanil, which is now even more potent, you're talking like a few grains of salt is the size of it. It's just a logistics issue for the Chinese. They can have this smuggled into the United States of America because it's smaller, it's easier to transport, but it has the same value and the same effect as 100 times heroin, right? So, you have less of a chance of getting caught. So the Chinese are intentionally doing this, and the historical context is they blame the United States for the opium epidemic at the turn of the last century, where the United States and the British particularly would allow the Chinese to get addicted to opium. So they think this is kind of a revenge against the U.S. So there's a war. That's another place we're at war right now, is in regards to these drugs coming in that are completely demoralizing people and turning them into zombies on our streets.
Yeah, I know. We call it the Fenty bend.
Yeah.
Where they just bend over.
Yeah.
It's actually really sad.
That's really horrible.
It breaks my heart. But so in a preparedness aspect of it, what are the warning signs that we need to be looking for as a younger generation that war could be potentially coming on our soil in a physical aspect?
So getting back to this strategy of the Russian military intelligence apparatus and the Chinese military intelligence apparatus, they agreed that the way to invade the United States was using a model that the Germans used to invade Norway in World War II. When I say that, most people are like, what are you talking about?
Right.
So what the Germans did is they sent in special forces teams ahead of time under the guise of businessmen into Norway. They had warehouses where they stockpiled weapons, cached weapons and ammunition. They had key communication nodes already set up. And then when it came to be invasion day, they actually sent a ship, a cargo ship, across the sea to Norway and around and through the British Navy. And quite literally in those containers, it was packed with soldiers. Wow. So when the Germans landed, the soldiers came off the boats, invaded Norway, and then those that were already there had the weapons for them and everything else. Yeah. And they took over Norway in it was really a few days, even though there was a Norwegian, resistance.
Right.
So they want to use this tactic as a Maoist insurgency model point in the United States. And so they've come as businessmen. The Jungle Tigers, which is the Chinese Special Forces, is known to be here in the United States. Some are estimating as many as 100,000. That is the equivalent of 10 U.S. Army divisions.
Wow.
Inside the U.S., manufacturing facilities with weapons cached. And people say, well, I think we would catch them at the ports. They don't inspect that many containers at the ports.
Right.
They don't physically have the capability to do it.
How would we prepare for something like that if they're already in the United States, if they already have warehouses full of weapons that we're unaware of? I mean, are there warehouses full of weapons? And how would we even prepare for something like that if it's already here?
Right. And people like Sarah Adams, former CIA targeter, saying, there could potentially be an October 7th style attack inside the United States of America. How do we prepare for it? Actually, the founding fathers had the answer to this. It's called the Second Amendment.
Amen.
It's called the Second Amendment. And so the idea was that every single able-bodied American was armed and trained in arms, that it would be the greatest deterrence to any invading enemy army. Japan actually analyzed this prior to World War II, how many people in the United States would be armed, and it was one of the deterrences of the Japanese actually invading the U.S. mainland. John F. Kennedy, actually, when he became president, he pursued a policy of what's called civil defense forces, civil defense. And this idea was going back to the Minuteman, going back to the militia, that every able-bodied person in the United States could be turned into a military force. And so they had National Guard armories placed in different cities so that the weapons would be completely decentralized and people could be rallied at a moment's notice to repel any kind of an invasion and be that deterrence force. So the greatest thing that we could do to prepare is to exercise the Second Amendment right that we all have, to train, be ready for this. And the third thing is to be aware, to understand that if you've got Chinese companies buying land in your area and you have an Air Force base nearby, for example, maybe there's a reason for that. And you should be asking your local elected officials, are you going to continue to let this stand? You should be asking your state elected officials, why are you letting this stand? That's why there's a move in Texas, Florida, other states, a whole bunch of other states actually have now banned the Chinese ownership of land because this has been happening.
That's great.
So those are some practical things.
Does the National Guard have anything like that now, where they have the weapons decentralized?
No, actually, in fact, the opposite happened. A bunch of people in the 1970s and 80s began to deconstruct that model and centralize National Guard armories and close the ones down in the city. In fact, the one here in downtown Spokane was turned into Laser Quest, in fact. So
I like Laser Quest, but it doesn't help me win a war.
No, it doesn't help you win a war. So I think we have the opportunity to do that again. I think President Trump should absolutely pursue that line of thought. And if anybody wants to, research this, Kyle Scheidler has put out a great book on the modern Minuteman, and the Center for Security Policy has done some work on talking about civil defense and what that would look like as a policy going forward. Because you have to have some regulated training. Right. That's what it means when it says a well-regulated militia, regularly trained militia in the Constitution. And so we need to see that done effectively and done decentralized. And I think it's something that Trump could pursue. It could be done within a year very easily to do that. We just have to have the will.
Just for some of us that may be a little slower, could you please define a Minuteman?
Yes, a Minuteman. I
am one of those that may be slightly slower.
So Minuteman, the idea in the American Revolutionary era, was they would have their weapons close at hand and they could be mobilized in a minute. In other words, they could grab their weapon, they could grab their ammunition, and they could be ready to face a threat in a minute. Okay?
I would like to be a minute woman.
Yes. Which, if you're exercising your Second Amendment right, you should be a minute man or a minute woman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I have another more practical question. If war were to come to the U.S. soil, what happens to the food in our normal day-to-day life? How would we buy groceries?
Well, it depends on what area you're in. One of the interesting pieces of America, in fact, there was a book written about it, Prisoners of Geography. I believe his name is Tim Marshall. He wrote why the United States is great because of its geography and why other countries aren't because of their geography. The United States is a very interesting country. We have a sea on both coasts, and we have a mountain range on both coasts. So an invading army would have to come across an ocean and then over a mountain range to get into the interior. We also have a huge navigable river system in the interior of the United States where we could use boats and barges, and we have for 100 years, to move supplies up and down. The inland Northwest actually is a microcosm of that because we have two mountain ranges and a navigable river system in the middle as well. So our geography itself is very good. And so what that means is our food is grown in more protected areas, and then it is exported and it travels to the coasts. So if you're in a coastal region and China invades, you're probably not going to be getting groceries. If you are, or at least readily, if you are just in the interior, of the mountain ranges, there might be some disruption. So the answer to that is, and you'll see this all over the place, people are starting to grow gardens again. We grow our own food, right? And it's enjoyable, and you don't need to have a huge garden plot. You just have to have a few raised beds. Learn how to grow a garden and try to prepare, keep at least, start with 6 months supply of food on hand. And some people think that's daunting. It's actually very, very simple to do that. And we have some ideas on what those should be. But, try to have 6 months food on hand. Try to grow your own food because that's something that practically you can do. And the worst case scenario is maybe in 10 years, you have all your neighbors over to eat it all. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And another practical question, what would we do with our animals? Like, what if you have exotic pets?
Like?
Well, I had
fish?
Ferrets.
And fish?
I have a fish named Pastor Matt Jr.
Yes, you do.
But we don't have to talk about him. I'm more thinking, like, if...
I'm sorry to break this to you, but your exotic animals are going to have far less value in a situation like that.
Are you saying you're going to have to use them for fur and warmth?
You said that, I didn't.
No, I'm just asking.
A ferret jacket might be warm, come in handy. Maybe ferret gloves, ferret hat.
That's so sad. That is not the answer I wanted.
Ferret earmuffs?
No.
Okay.
That's quite tragic, actually. I don't think that would be cute at all, but if there was war, I really don't think I'd be worried about how I looked.
I think, again, practically, some people have exotic animals. Maybe you should look at maybe having some chickens as well, because that would be a lot more useful in such a situation.
Correct. I also feel like as Americans, when you're on social media for a long time, I look at the world and I think, gosh, we are the most unprepared generation in the world. I just see how we spend our time, what we look at, what we eat, what we do, and I'm like, I feel like my grandparents were way more readily prepared, maybe because they actually lived through war. So I think
when we come back from the break, I actually have a couple real-world stories about exactly that.
What if I told you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today. And we're back with our Gen Z episode, our very first one. Matt Shea here with Megan Needham, talking about World War III. What would this generation do? And you were saying that this generation is just not very prepared.
Because what would happen if all the cell towers went down, all communication went out? Where would we go? What would we do? Everything is electronics based. Even our cars. If someone set off an EMP, isn't that what it's called? The electromagnetic pulse? Our cars would stop working.
Maybe if you have an EMP shield on your car, it probably would continue working.
They make those?
They make those EMP shield. And I don't get anything from EMP shield for mentioning this, but they have EMP shields for your house and your car, and it's fairly inexpensive to put them in. Yeah,
I think that would be a wise thing for all of us to do because how electronics based we are.
Yeah, back to ferrets. Probably not going to make it, but okay.
What about cats?
Dogs have a more practical value than cats do. Cats help keep the mice down in barns, because I know somebody's going to email me that. Dogs serve as an early warning. Okay. And in particular, this was discovered actually in South Africa. One of the best early warning systems is big dogs outside and small dogs inside. And the small dogs actually will alert the big dogs to the threat before the big dogs figure it out.
So Pomeranians are useful.
Chihuahuas are very useful. Yes, they are.
Wow.
In fact, we might have to bring up a picture of one of the Chihuahuas here soon.
We should.
So a couple stories. You said, this generation doesn't seem as prepared as maybe, grandma's generation. And I remember my grandmother had a huge cabinet full of food, pantry full of food. And she lived through the Great Depression, and she's like, that's never going to happen again. We're never going to be short of food again. And she never was. And people say, oh, that's just extreme. No, it really isn't. Because you give the food away and it helps to feed people from the street, or you invite your neighbors over. It's just a blessing to everybody to be prepared in that scenario. Second story that I would share with you is this. So my brother-in-law was in Ukraine, and I called him a few days ahead of when the war was going to start. And I said, hey, man, you need to get out of there and go to Spain. Pay for your hotel. You need to get out and go to Spain. Get out of Ukraine, okay? And he's like, it's just Western propaganda. And I said, brother, I am literally looking at the satellite imagery. I'm watching them move up their hospital units and their ADA units. They are going to invade. Right. No, it's not going to happen. Brother, you need to listen to me, please. No. So the next phone call, rockets were flying over his house. And he's like, what do I do? What do I do? And I said, you need to go down to the grocery store right now, and you need to buy as much food as you possibly can. Take everything that you have and buy food now, okay?
Yeah.
And he lived in Kharkiv, actually just on the outskirts of Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, but it's the largest city that is right near Russia. Mm-hmm. So my brother-in-law, God bless him, and I love him because he's safe now and he's in the United States legally. Amen. But he was like, I'm going to the store. And I was like, okay, call me when you get back. So he gets back from the store. I'm like, okay, what'd you buy? And he's like, about this and this and that and this and this and that. I was like, that sounds like only 3 days' food. And he said, yeah, it's about 3 days' food. And I said, I told you to go buy everything you could. And he says, well, no, but the stores are still open. And I was like, I said, there was still, and this is the professional term, normalcy bias.
Right.
That things will continue the way they always have continued, that prevented him from even grasping, even when rockets are flying over his house.
Right.
Missiles prevented him from grasping the gravity of the situation that he's in. So my message to the Jacob generation is, hey, this stuff is real. These are some real world stories. And how much better off would he have been had he had 6 months worth of supplies? Because the thing is he's diabetic as well. And his medicine started to run out.
Yeah.
And then he had to actually go through an active combat zone where they were actually shooting at each other to get him and his family out. And thank God they were protected and weren't killed, but some people in the party that were trying to get out with them were.
Oh my gosh.
This is real stuff. It happened in 2 real countries, Russia and Ukraine, that people thought would never go to war. They're never going to fight. Okay? This is the reality of the world that we live in, and it's better to be prepared than not. And one of the sayings I really love is, I would rather be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Wow, that's insane. Do you think that war on U.S. soil can be prevented? Like, even if they are already here in warehouses preparing to invade in that way, can that be prevented in any way, or are we inevitably going to be fighting on our own land?
Well, jihadist networks and communist networks are already here in the United States. I only talked about the jungle tigers, but you also have Chinese funding of Marxist organizations here in the United States to foment rioting and to try to disrupt the U.S. No Kings movement, No Kings 2.0 now, very much intent on causing disruption and trying to gin up a summer of unrest. Now, they try to claim that they support and defend the Constitution of the United States, but the fact of the matter is, you cannot be a communist and an American at the same time.
No.
Because the one wants to overthrow the Constitution, the other is supporting the Constitution. Those two things are antithetical. So what can be done is to understand the threat first. So we have communist organizations and communist infiltration inside the United States.
Yes.
We also have jihadi infiltration. And, this third point I was talking about in Maoist insurgency doctrine, the Muslim Brotherhood has the Muslim Brotherhood special section here. The Iranians have sleeper cells here, Unit 910. They're all here in the United States. The question is always, how big are they? What's their footprint?
Right.
Over the last few weeks, the FBI under Kash Patel has arrested, I think, over 600 Iranians here in the United States, and that is, I think, an attempt to disrupt those cells. Also, Trump today said that Zoran Mamdani in New York, the person that won the Democrat primary there, that we don't want communists in the United States, and was actually looking at his immigration paperwork and his naturalization paperwork. So the way to stop it, a war here, is to disrupt those networks, arrest those folks, get them out of this country if they're here illegally. And then, in addition to that, Trump is already taking steps to prevent a third world war. He is depriving China of the economic ability to wage war, and he's doing that through tariffs. A lot of people don't understand how tariffs work.
Yeah.
We want American companies to be manufacturing and jobs to come to America. And for the better part of 3 decades, we have been selling out our jobs overseas. And that's why a lot of the Jacob generation does not have work right now, because those jobs were sent overseas.
Right.
So tariffs bring jobs back to the United States, number one. And number two, at least with regards to China, the studies showed that any tariff over 10% was going to negatively affect the Chinese economy and drive it down. And if the Chinese economy goes farther down, they don't have the economic ability to wage war, and that's the most important. You could talk about tanks and guns and airplanes, but if your economy can't wage a war, then you're stuck.
Yeah.
The second way is with the attacks on Iran, and I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this. It was something like 91% of the oil exports out of Iran were going to China. So if that's the case, and it accounted for almost a quarter of Chinese imports of oil, okay, between 20 and 25%. So if that's the case, then we're depriving China of the fuel to wage war. That's something Trump is doing if that regime turns to a Western power. So Trump understands this. The two big things, the economy and fuel, he's going after those right now to prevent a world war. But back to what I was talking about in the beginning, how did I see this that far ahead, and how did others see that? You can see how the Chinese are acting, the way that they're building right now, building ships faster than anybody else right now,
right?
And ships that have a dual purpose, particularly to invasion barges. And you're seeing also how the Chinese are corrupting certain governments in the island chains surrounding China.
Yeah.
And their aggressive footprints and actions in the diplomatic sphere. In addition to that, the United States has started to build up in the Pacific in bases that haven't been even used since World War II. In fact, I saw a U.S. Satellite picture of Tinian Air Base that hadn't been used since World War II. In a year, it went from jungle to an operational air base, according to those satellite photos.
Wow.
So there's a couple of specific examples.
So I've been seeing a lot of liberal movements wanting to start communist and socialist parties in the United States. And I know when we were in Seattle, there was the Communist Association, American Association, or something like that, and then the socialists. And I don't feel like people really understand what that means, because in my opinion, if I'm going to be blunt, if you would like a communist country, go move to one. If you would like to support these countries, go move to one and see how they support the way that you live your life, because quite frankly, a lot of the countries you're fighting for in the streets right now would execute you because you use they them pronouns. So what I'm really confused about is why a lot of people my age in the Jacob generation are fighting for communist and socialist ideals in the United States. Go to a socialist country.
Try it out.
See how you like it. See how you like that wage that they give you for a year, and you have the 10 richest people in the world taking everything from you.
Or better yet, try mouthing off like you do here in the United States on social media in a communist country. See how that goes over.
Yeah, protest the king in that country. See how you like it.
Right?
My grandfather's rolling in his grave right now fighting against the Russians in Hungary, and he's seeing the country that he moved to, that he fought for, is now trying to push socialist and communist ideals on our population. I don't understand why we would even fight if we want to just change into every other country in the world.
I mean, the Chinese have a social credit score system, so you have access to the economy based on how compliant you are. And it's so interesting to me that these folks that say we want communism really have no grasp about it, and don't. If I say the name Yuri Bezmenov, most people have never heard of him, although he's far more known today than he was even 10 years ago when we were talking about him, and almost nobody was. You have this cognitive disconnect between reality, what communism actually is,
right,
and the freedom that you are actually living under right now that gives you even the ability to talk about communism.
Right.
And I think when we come back from the break, I'll talk a little bit about Yuri Bezmenov and the plan that the KGB had, and the Izvestia, which is the disinformation arm of the KGB, to really degrade America and take it down. And this will be an answer to your question about some warning signs. When you start to see these things happen, and we are right now, we're right on the edge of something. Stay tuned and join us after the break.
What if I told you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today.
And we're back. Megan Needham and Matt Shea here, talking on a special episode of Patriot Radio. We're going to be doing this going into the future, talking to Gen Z with some authenticity for Gen Z and some primary source materials so you can go do your own research and you can discover the truth for yourself. So, wow, Yuri Bezmenov.
Yeah, communist socialism and the words that the Liberal Party likes to throw around, like fascism. When you see those street interviews, people like Benny Johnson going around asking, what is fascism? They don't even know.
They really don't have a clue.
What even is the definition of communism? What is fascism? What is socialism?
So you have huge disputes over this, but I think that the easiest way to think about these things is that there are 5 types of government and 5 types of economic systems. The 5 types of government: anarchy, or 0% power, which really never lasts very long or we call it the rule of none, because ultimately whoever's strongest is going to start ruling. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have monarchy, or 100% power, the rule of one, but that never really lasts long either, because one person can't do everything, and they have to have other people that are helping them. So that never really is, these aren't really 2 true government forms.
Even the monarchy in England has a parliament.
They have parliament, they've got all kinds of people that help them,
So really, wouldn't dictatorship be the rule of one?
It could be, but again, a dictator isn't put there himself. He has a group that raises him up to power, right?
Interesting.
So that's called, when you have a group like that, the dictator might be the public face, but you got a group like that's called an oligarchy, or the rule of some, okay? The rule of a few. And then you have democracy, which is rule of the mob, where 50.01% can vote away the rights of the rest. And we don't live in a democracy in the United States. I'm going to say that again. We do not live in a democracy. Comes from the Greek demos kratein, or people rule. We do not live in a democracy. We are not guaranteed a democracy. It is in none of the founding documents, none of the 50 state constitutions. In fact, the founding fathers said we do not want a democracy. And people are like, oh no, then what do you want? I'm going to explain it. Just wait. Okay? A democracy never really exists for very long because ultimately somebody's going to vote away the rights of the minority and then take control. And the people that take control will be the oligarchy. Okay?
Exactly.
So really, democracy is a transitional form of government. That's not me saying it. Those are what the words of the founding fathers, like James Madison said. There really are only two types of governments, an oligarchy and a republic. Republic comes from the Latin res publica, or the public thing, the rule of law. And the idea with a republic is that no matter who's in charge, the minority will always have the same rights, and they can never be voted away because those rights come from God. Our Constitution, Article 4, guarantees a republican form of government in the United States. So it has been a psychological operation, quite literally for 100 years, to try to get us to believe we are in a democracy when we live in a republic. So those are the 5 forms of government: anarchy, republic, which is limited government, but rule of law; democracy, which is a transitional form of government; rule of the mob; and then you have, I would say, monarchy, again, it never really exists. You really have an oligarchy, which is the rule of a few, and then monarchy obviously is the 5th one. So those are 5 types of government. There are 5 types of economy. You have a free market economy, which means the capital is owned and controlled by the people. And that's why Zoran Mamdani is so dangerous, because just the other day a video surfaced where he said we need to seize all capital. That is a communist doctrine, and it is a communist phrase.
What does it mean to seize all capital?
It means I can come in and take your business anytime I want to.
For why?
I can steal from you, is what it means. Because I know better how it should be used than you do.
Oh my gosh. And he just won the primary.
He just won the primary. Yeah, and that's the root of communism. Communism is rooted in envy and theft. It is rooted in it. So in a free market, the private individual owns and controls the capital. So I own and control things. From a biblical worldview, this comes from the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not steal implies that I own something that can be stolen, right? Which means I need to be stewarding it well. I don't go mess up the environment for my own selfish or greedy reasons. I steward it well, but I do have responsibility for the property that I have to do that and to make it a blessing to others. I mean, that's the biblical worldview. So in a free market economy, capital, or the means of production, are owned and controlled privately. Means of production could be land, because you can grow something on the land. Could be an axe, because that could chop down a tree and form it into something. The means of production. The next type of economy is fascism. Okay, and fascism has always been on the left side of the spectrum. I don't believe in a left-right paradigm necessarily, but I'm going to use it because that's what people understand.
Right.
Fascism came out of socialism.
Okay.
Okay, so the father of fascism, although it's a little bit more complicated than that, Benito Mussolini was a socialist. In fact, he was the chief editor of the socialist newspaper in Italy called Avanti, which means, wait for it, forward.
Oh my gosh.
Have you seen that? Have you seen that campaign slogan, forward?
Yeah.
That's where it comes from. It is a socialist campaign slogan from the early 1900s. So fascism, what the idea was that the government controls capital, but it's owned privately. The trains will run on time, etc., but you need to meet certain requirements and regulations. That's why the birth of the bureaucratic state is fascist, in the sense of controlling large swaths of the economy instead of it being owned and controlled privately. That's why Americans believe in limited government, so that footprint is as small as possible.
So why do people throw the term fascist at Donald Trump so flippantly?
Because it came from Joseph Stalin. They are quite literally parroting Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin, a communist, needed to distinguish himself from the National Socialists, which is the third type of economy. The National Socialists were in Germany, otherwise known as the Nazis. That's literally what it stands for.
Wow.
And so he needed to distinguish himself between the socialists in Germany and the communists in Russia. So he called them fascists. And Benito Mussolini called himself a fascist because the Italians couldn't accept full socialism in Italy, but they could accept some control, and that's what he advocated for. Hitler went to Mussolini and said, hey, I like what you're doing down here. We're not going to call it fascism. We're going to call it National Socialism. National Socialism went a step further than fascism and controlled key sectors of manufacturing. So the government controlled key sectors of capital in that country. Volkswagen was started by the German government, owned and controlled by the German government. So the government owned and controlled some key sectors, but there was still some private ownership, factories and other things in the rest of society. They just wanted to control the key things like the war-making machinery and war-making industry in Germany. The fourth type of economy is socialism, where it goes a step farther than fascism and National Socialism, and you see the control of key sectors of the economy, not just manufacturing, but key sectors of the economy. So, for example, healthcare, communication, national public, exactly. Key things, key sectors of the economy where the government owns and controls those things so it can own and control the entire country. But wait, there's still some private ownership and control of some capital, but it's limited.
I still don't understand why they would call Donald Trump a fascist then, because he is, he's a self-made billionaire.
Right. So it's totally false on its face. Regardless of what you think about him, it's a lie.
Makes absolutely zero sense because, they clearly don't understand the basis of socialism or communism. I see how people can be misled into thinking that communism and socialism is a good thing because they think that it's going to equally disperse wealth amongst the people. But I think what they don't realize is the damage that it has done in every other country that it has been implemented in.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the discussions regarding this came from one coffee house, like literally Lenin and Hitler, same coffee house, okay? And you can begin to understand that the thinkers of that time were discussing just varying degrees of the same theory that the government should own and control capital. The question was how much. Communism, the last type of economy, government owns and controls everything. There is no private ownership, no private control of anything. So that obviously is horrendous tyranny.
Right.
And so when you have all these young folks in the United States saying that they're advocating for socialism, they have no clue who Yuri Bezmenov is. They have no clue about economies. And so what they're advocating for literally is their own destruction, because here's how it works.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yuri Bezmenov was a member of Izvestia, the disinformation arm of the KGB. He defected to the United States of America, and he talked about the 4 stages of subversion of America. The first stage of subversion is demoralization. In other words, taking the morals from society. We're seeing that happen.
We're there.
The second was destabilization, unrest, riots, trying to get people not to trust institutions that they've trusted in the past.
We're getting there.
The third is chaos, like some chaotic event inside the country. And this is what people need to look for. Chaotic events inside the country that would divide the country.
COVID.
Yeah. Interesting how this happens. And then the last is called normalization, where it becomes the new normal. That is literally a Soviet term. You need to get used to this COVID stuff. It is the new normal.
They literally said that
Yep.
in the campaigns. This is the new normal. We are never going back to the way things were. Wearing a mask is your new normal.
Yep, that's a KGB phrase. So, if you understand this, then you understand the last thing that Yuri Bezmenov said. He said the folks that are on the ground right now think they're going to be in charge when the communist revolution takes place. These students that are protesting all this think they're going to be in charge. They're not going to be in charge. They're going to be lined up and shot. Those are his words, not mine. Because They're the, quote, useful idiots. That's Lenin's term, end quote.
Oh.
So they're used to take power, and then they're all killed. It happened in Germany. It was called the Night of the Long Knives, where the ground troops, the brown shirts as they were called, okay, which were socialists, the brown shirts were rounded up, thrown in prison or killed on one night by the black shirts, the ones who were actually in charge, and ushered in the German regime in its full.
So they killed their own soldiers.
Yeah, so these students out there, when I say they're bringing in their own destruction, that's exactly what they are doing, and they have no clue how communism actually works because they have not read history. They've only read what they've been spoon-fed to believe, and those people are ginning up a hatred inside of them toward their fellow man that it becomes an emotional thing that is taken advantage of and manipulated.
That's absolutely horrendous. And they don't have any clue what they're getting involved with in reality. They have no idea that they're doing this to themselves. And even when you try and say, hey, this is the history of what you're standing behind, they spit in your face.
That's right.
And they yell at you, and it's, like you said, an emotional thing instead of a logical thing. No, actually, this is what you're standing for. This is what you're standing on for, the destruction of humankind.
Yep, and yourself.
And the destruction and dismantling of religion in total, and they're trying to take God out of the world.
Yeah, I mean, there were, in the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto, there were 4 very clear goals. Abolish private property, abolish nations and borders. Isn't that so interesting?
Oh my gosh.
Okay, and when you see them taking property, you understand they're trying to deprive you of the ability to fight back, just so we're very clear on that. Abolishing the family, and then abolishing all truth and all religion. So why would you abolish truth unless you were doing it to manipulate people? This is the core of communism, the core of socialism. And for those out there that are Christians who may be flirting with socialism, socialism is decidedly anti-Christian because it's based on the gospel of envy and the gospel of theft. But also, Karl Marx had poems that were decidedly satanic, and you can go read those for yourselves.
So saying that it's going to destroy nations and borders, so essentially communism is a globalist movement, and then to bring in a one world government, one world order, one person in charge,
yep,
to make everyone subservient to their ideals.
Yep, and it sounds like a great topic for the next show.
Absolutely.
This is Matt Shea. Thank you for joining me and Megan Needham today with our first Gen X, Gen Z, Jacob generation, Isaac generation, and everybody in between show to really explain in detail and give you the primary source documents so you can find the truth for yourself. Thank you for joining me today. May God bless all of you. This is really the greatest generation. Embrace that and keep up the fight.